my great honor to open up the 29th annual Norris and Margery Bendetson International EPIIC Symposium, this year dedicated to the Middle East and North Africa. I'd like to bring forward our Chief Academic Officer, our Provost, David Harris, to make the introduction. Sir.
Thanks, Sherman. I also want to welcome you to the end of the first full day, I believe, of the 29th Annual Norris and Margery Bendetson EPIIC International Symposium. So let me begin by introducing and recognizing Bobby and Joanne Bendetson, sitting in the front row. So generously endowed the EPIIC Symposium, but I'm sorry, Bobby, but let me even more importantly recognize Margery Bendetson, who's here. I also recognize the Carnegie Corporation, which has provided us with quite generous resources, which have helped to enhance this year's symposium. Last on my list is just to recognize, put your hand up if you would, the IGL board. Where's the IGL board members? I know there's a bunch of you here. It's quite an engaged group that makes a huge positive impact on EPIIC and on IGL. So thanks for everything you do for Tufts and for IGL. So I have two questions. The first one is, so what is EPIIC anyway? I'm not sure I have enough time to answer that question fully, but I can say that, EPIIC is, I've been here a year and a half, and it's amazing. EPIIC is an integrated, multidisciplinary program that really does, as best I can tell, prepare young people to play active roles in their communities. That's locally, nationally, and globally. It's student-centered. It's a lot of student involvement, student engagement in planning it and making it happen. And it's also something that involves a year-long colloquium. About 50 students heavily involved, working very closely with Sherman and with one another to develop this. There's a list of the topics in the front of the brochure. I just draw your attention to a few of them. It's quite a range of topics. It started with international terrorism as the first symposium 29 years ago. It had one that Sherman, I think I want to see if there's a transcript of. It's the 1995 symposium, which was on 2020 visions of the future, anticipating 2020. We're getting close enough. It'd be interesting to check back and see what you were predicting. We also have global poverty and inequality, and then of course, this year, the future of the Middle East and North Africa. So what about Tufts? How does EPIIC and how do IGL, how do they connect with Tufts? To understand that, it's very simple. It's just looking at our recently approved strategic plan, university-wide strategic plan. You're going to see three core themes. And I think they're going to resonate quite easily with what you've experienced and will experience throughout the rest of EPIIC and what you experience as part of IGL. The first is enabling and integrating transformational experiences. It's about getting people out of their comfort zones, out of their intellectual comfort zones, their social, their cultural. And then importantly, helping them to take those transformational experiences that result and integrate them into their professional, academic, and personal development. And that's what the students are certainly experiencing as part of that and what you're experiencing over these few days. The second is about engaging and celebrating commonalities and differences. It's hard to think of a better way to do that, especially the type of engagement diversity we talk about, than right now coming together and really learning about people who are living very different lives from the ones you're living. And lastly, creating an innovative approach to local and global challenge. And what that's about is taking not just the disciplinary, theory-based work, but also taking interdisciplinary, non-traditional, and practical work and pulling that together to both understand and solve some of today's most pressing challenges. It's clearly what we're working on here. And now, I have the distinct privilege of introducing, because he just walked up here, just very briefly, a person who needs no introduction to this group for sure, IGL Director Sherman Teichman. But let me just say a couple things. Sherman is both the creator and promoter of the incredible creative activity that is EPIIC and IGL. He's quite a force, and I just recount, I asked the person I had dinner with, so how exactly did you get involved coming from, I'll just say another country. And the story I heard, I bet he's not the only person who could have told this story. Well, I heard about this guy named Sherman at Tufts. I was told I should connect with him, I had a phone call, and 3 hours later, the person said, I decided this was really cool and I had to get involved and bring my students. So Sherman, thanks for everything you do for Tufts and everyone who's come to this event.
Good evening, folks. This evening is the product of an extraordinary fusion, an intellectual collaboration. Our students are the core. They are our metric. They are our beating heart. They are what inspire us. They are what make us continue to probe after almost 3 decades. There's one particular person who I would like to hear the customary roar for, and that's my colleague, my associate director, who has been at every aspect of every sinew and every synapse here, and that's Heather Barry. It's been almost a 3-decade-long relationship. This is a deliberate moment. There is much to say, and the acknowledgments will come after our panel. The sequence of the events this evening are a series of introductions and short acknowledgments by myself. And then we have the honor of having one of our students introduce our colloquium and this effort this year. And then we have a bit of a montage and an acknowledgement, and we will then have an extraordinary moment with the Deputy Secretary of State, William Norris. And then a rather remarkable panel on U.S. foreign policy in the region, with many people from many different aspects and many different origins, the audience willing to challenge and interact with you. I've been asked to, well, you know what I was thinking before I read this, David, where are you? So I think I've buried the time capsule for 2020 in the Provost's office. So we'll see what happens. This is a greeting from the Carnegie Corporation, to which we're greatly indebted. And this will sum up in many ways better than I can what I think our students have achieved and the reputation that we have won because of them. Dear Sherman, on behalf of Vartan Gregorian, President of Carnegie Corporation, and with greetings to my corporation colleagues in attendance, Media Relations Manager Celeste Ford and Program Assistant Lori Michieli, I send my best wishes for the symposium sessions I will miss and look forward to being there for the closing days. This is a letter from Pat Nicholas, the Project Manager of International Programs, who will be with us the next several days. For those less familiar with the Carnegie Corporation of New York, it is a century-old philanthropic legacy of Scottish-American industrialist Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie the man was passionate about education and peace. Carnegie, the foundation, uses those passions as the strategic pillars upon which it has built 100 years of grant-making that contributes to social change through scholarship. 1 year ago, Sherman, you introduced me to the EPIIC experience. I was assessing the merits of the Institute to determine its potential for corporation funding. We both realized full well that tomorrow's global challenges demand a generation of international security experts who can deal with complexity, bridge cultural and political differences, and engage as responsible global citizens. The Institute for Global Leadership fills that gap. Only a few endeavors I know in my decades of philanthropy incubate in your innovative and intergenerational ways. Only a handful of corporation-funded projects over these 100 years work at the undergraduate level. I look forward to working with you as you culminate your work on the Middle East and North Africa, and turn your focus to, and here's where we reveal next year, Russia. A second issue of importance to the corporation's legacy of supporting peace and security efforts. Sincerely, Pat Nicholas, Project Manager, International Programs. It's happening. This is a tribute to our students. I would like to ask one of them, Gabriella, to come forward and introduce this year's forum.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Ambassador Burns, students, professors, families, and friends. Salam alaikum, Baruchim Habayim. It is my great honor to introduce on behalf of my class 2014 EPIIC Symposium on the history of the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Gabriella Zoia. I am a junior studying international relations here at Tufts, and I'm a transfer student from Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Qatar. It's my first year here. It is with some trepidation that I stand in front of you here today, mostly because I would never thought I'd be here. I joined the EPIIC Colloquium at the beginning of the year because I correctly believed that it would be an excellent opportunity to learn more about the region that I've become fascinated with in my 2 years in Qatar, and because I also correctly assumed that it would be a group full of fantastic and magnificent students. I fondly remember, as many of our peers do, one of our first classes with Justine Hardy, an expert on conflict, trauma, and resilience. She spoke to us about the power of discomfort. As she was speaking, I thought she was talking about me. She succinctly summarized the raw feeling of discomfort of when someone is placed out of their comfort zone and open their eyes to a very different reality in front of them. Later that week, I approached Sherman that I was grateful for the opportunity, but that I felt inadequate for the caliber of the class. Sherman simply looked at me and said, "Well, kiddo, I asked that you give it another chance after Outward Bound. As many of you have probably heard, we are an intellectual community, so please embrace the serendipity of it." As an innately suspicious person, I half-heartedly believed him and resolved to give it another chance. What followed was Outward Bound. As an Italian, I never experienced these full immersion camps that bond the community over simple tasks. Yet I found myself building traverse bridges over a pond and running around looking for one of our teams that had gotten lost in the woods during our refugee simulation. We spent our nights discussing North African politics with Professor Hubert Roberts, even when our tea was cold and the camp was quiet. In just a few days, many of us interacted as if we were old friends. We are students from all years, a variety of different religions, 19 nationalities, including Afghanistan, Brazil, and China, and 25 languages. You have already heard this morning from Yasser Abbas, an Iraqi who served as a translator for the U.S. military. On campus, we're involved in athletics, spoken word activism, Greek life, and hijab, just to name a few of the many. It was the spirit of community then that has prevailed throughout the EPIIC Symposium. Whether it was the time that our freshmen brought cake to the library at midnight, the night before our second midterm, or the time that we prepared snowballs to pelt at Sherman because he held class when really it should have been a snow day. From the beautiful foliage of New Hampshire to the snowy days of Somerville, our community has been completed with the excellent array of experts that we've had in our class. Every time I try to explain to someone what the EPIIC Colloquium is, never very successful, the reaction is always open-mouthed awe at the incredible opportunity that we have here. We began our colloquium with Scott Anderson lecturing us on his book Lawrence in Arabia, an excellent overview of the implications of World War I for the region. We have welcomed Charles Sennett, the founder and editor of Global Post, who joined us to speak about Egypt and the Arab Spring. He reminded us of the solidarity that we had in 2011 when people our age went into the streets demanding the same rights that we were fortunate enough to have. Professor Richard Schultz complemented this with a lecture on security sector reform and its importance for the establishment of a functioning and sustainable nation-state. Kurt Rhodes from Quesco not only detailed the conditions of the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, which has now become its fourth largest city, but also the difficulties of psychological healing and community reconciliation. Muhir Rabbani spoke to us about the unsustainable status quo in Palestine and the conditions of the Oslo Accords, which sparked a fierce debate within our class after. Noah Bonse from the International Crisis Group spoke on the question of the Kurds and the internal divisions of the Syrian opposition. Isabel Coleman of the Council of Foreign Relations introduced us her book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet, an account of women and democracy in the Middle East. These are just mere snapshots into a semester of knowledge, thought-provoking questions, and strong and vibrant discussions. By winter break, we took the knowledge that we had learned from countless experts, 4,916 pages of reading, hours of lectures, the discussion sessions, and study groups to go to our country of our choice in the Middle East within reason, so thank you moms and dads, to research a topic that had intrigued us in our studies. We went to Egypt, Iraqi Kurdistan, Israel, Palestine, Turkey, Jordan, and Tunisia. You will hear more about their research and their wonderful eye-opening experiences in the coming days of the symposium. What I have the distinct honor to present to you today then is the culmination of hours of work, countless meetings and conversations. It is my hope that the ideas and topics put forth in the following days challenge your thinking. We ask you what has been asked of us in the class, which is to suspend your preconceptions and embrace the serendipity of new knowledge. Thank you and welcome to the 2014 EPIIC Symposium on the Future of the Middle East and North Africa.
It's my very great privilege to ask the Dean of the Fletcher School, our new Dean, who's brought an extraordinary amount of energy and optimism and intellect and sensibility about policy and its complexity, James Stavridis, Admiral Stavridis, to please come forward to introduce our distinguished keynote.
Well, I do want to echo the thanks to the Bendetson clan who are represented here today for supporting this, and congratulate Sherman for yet again putting together a rockin' house here with all kinds of things happening. You know, Bobby Bendetson and Sherman Teichman share an extremely important quality that I want to elaborate briefly, which is if either one of them ever asks you to do something, just go ahead and do it. Because you're going to do it in the end. And you'll just save a lot of time by saying yes, which is kind of why I'm here right now. This is a wonderful event, and I think it's indicative of how we link together the Fletcher School. We are so proud to be a graduate school of Tufts University and be part of this university with our undergraduate population. You are all very much a part of the Fletcher community, and we feel very much part of this Tufts community. And it's a joy to welcome so many folks here from other universities around the country, including, I see some from West Point and Annapolis, as a former military, a recovering military person. I have to give them a shout out, but we have so many here from so many places. My very, very happy role tonight is to introduce a great friend of mine of a decade, Ambassador William Bill Burns. Bill Burns has had an extraordinary 32-year career in the Foreign Service of his nation. He is also a scholar. We welcome into this scholarly place a PhD from Oxford. He has also served twice as an ambassador of the United States, once to Russia and once to Jordan. He knows this region that we're examining tonight deeply, both from his time as a practitioner in the region, as well as serving at the National Security Council and in the ultimate post within State Department focused on the region. Today, Bill is the second senior member of the State Department, only behind the Secretary of State, John Kerry. He is one of only 2 career Foreign Service officers who has attained that position in the history of the Republic. It speaks volumes about his professionalism, his deep knowledge of the world, and his sense of leadership that he would be chosen for this. He is also, I can tell you personally, endlessly kind. He is thoughtful. He is someone who leads by example in every case. He has also led the policy planning staff at the very heart of State Department's strategic process. You are in for an enormous treat tonight from America's leading professional diplomat, Ambassador Bill Burns. Please, sir.
everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think can you hear me okay in the back? Good. Anyway, I am truly honored to join so many people I deeply admire, like Jim Stavridis, at this symposium. I was warned that EPIIC was not just an acronym, but also an adjective for the breadth and length of the symposium's panels. And looking through the program, I see that these were indeed pretty credible warnings. So to allow a lot of time for questions and to make sure that I don't delay the beginning of this evening's distinguished panel, I promise that my remarks will be brief. Whenever I think of the value of brevity in public speaking, I'm reminded of a story that involved the famous author George Bernard Shaw. Shaw was hosting an event in London one evening, and the first speaker came up to him and asked how long he should keep his opening remarks. And Shaw told him he should probably limit them to about 20 minutes. And the speaker looked at him in horror and said, 20 minutes? How am I supposed to tell them everything I know in 20 minutes? And Shaw paused and replied, in your case, my advice would be to speak very slowly. In my case, you don't have to worry about me going beyond 20 minutes, even if I speak very slowly. So I do promise to try to be brief. I wish I could also promise to be uplifting, but that's a little harder. The Middle East is a place, as all of you know, where pessimists seldom lack for either company or validation, where skeptics hardly ever seem wrong. It's a place where American policymakers often learn humility the hard way. A place where you can most easily see the wisdom in Winston Churchill's famous comment that what he liked most about Americans was that they usually did the right thing in the end. They just like to exhaust all the alternatives first. So I learned a few things about the Middle East during my own checkered 32-year career in the Foreign Service. I've learned that stability is not a static phenomenon, and that regimes which do not offer their citizens a sense of political dignity and economic possibility ultimately become brittle and break. I've learned that change in the Middle East is rarely neat or linear, but often messy and cruel, and deeply unpredictable in its second and third order consequences. I've learned not to underestimate the depth of mistrust of American motives that animate so many people in the region. And I've learned that we often get far more credit than we deserve for complicated conspiracies. I've learned that with all its stubborn dysfunction, the Middle East is a place where people and leaders are capable of great things, and that American diplomacy, with all of our own occasional dysfunction, can make a real and enduring difference. So let me first talk briefly about why the Middle East still matters in American foreign policy and how the Middle East is changing, and then outline several elements of a positive American policy agenda. What we can do to help shape, within the limits of our influence, the great generational struggle between moderation and extremism that is unfolding across the Middle East today. After a post-9/11 decade dominated by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not hard to see why Americans would seek to rebalance our priorities. We live in a rapidly changing world in which American interests are pulled in many different directions. I recently returned from a long trip to Asia, and it's obvious that the Asia-Pacific region is not only the most dynamic part of the global economy in the new century which lies ahead, but also a logical centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. The transformation of the global energy market through the shale technology revolution is also affecting our views of the Middle East. With the United States likely to overtake Saudi Arabia as the world's leading oil producer in the next 5 years or so, and with the prospect of genuine energy independence for this country in the next 20 years or so, it's natural to wonder if we really need to pay so much attention to the Middle East. And it is a truism that America's chief foreign policy challenge is domestic renewal, strengthening our homegrown capacity to compete and promote our interests and values around the world. Tempting though it may be, we do not have the luxury of pivoting away from the Middle East. which sometimes has a nasty way of reminding us of its relevance. We don't have the luxury of pivoting away from a part of the world that holds some of our closest allies and a very sizable chunk of the world's oil reserves, on which the global economy is still dependent, even if we're headed towards self-sufficiency. And we don't have the luxury of pivoting away from a part of the world that holds several of the world's most poisonous regional conflicts and violent extremists who feed on the region's bitterness and alienation. We cannot, in short, afford to neglect what's at stake in a region going through its own awakening, at once promising and painful, and potentially every bit as consequential for international order as the changes which swept over Europe and Eurasia 2 decades ago. It's important to understand, I think, that this second Arab awakening, more than a half century after the first awakening helped end the colonial era, is about several different layers of change, within, among, and beyond Arab states. Within a number of states, the spark produced by a desperate Tunisian vendor, tired of too many indignities and too many lost hopes, proved highly combustible. Within months of that tragic self-immolation, a half-century-old political order collapsed in several Arab states, including Egypt, the biggest of all. Societies that for far too long had known far too little freedom, far too little opportunity, and far too little dignity began to erupt. But what also spilled out, in addition to the thirst of individual citizens for dignity, were all the demons of sectarian and communal tension that authoritarian rulers had forcefully contained. That dynamic, in turn, helped set off new uncertainties and frictions among states in the region, as sectarian troubles and old Sunni Shia passions spilled across borders still not firmly rooted nearly a century after their post-World War I formation. Meanwhile, beyond Arab states, violent extremist groups were quick to try to fill emerging vacuums and take advantage of post-revolutionary chaos. Non-Arab regional powers like Turkey, Israel, and Iran loomed larger as traditional Arab powers like Egypt turned inward, and major external players like China and India grew even more reliant on access to regional energy supplies. And across this whole shifting landscape, the second Arab awakening stirred up familiar debates about the role of religion in politics, gender equality, individual human rights, and globalization. What all of these layers of change add up to is the most significant transition in the Arab world since the revolutions of the 1950s. And what they have laid bare is the long-term question of whether an Arab center, as my friend and former Jordanian Foreign Minister Marwan Mubashir has described it, can eventually replace the old order, gradually establishing democratic institutions to manage sectarian differences and provide an outlet for political pluralism and individual dignity, or whether hardliners and extremists of one stripe or another will prove more resilient. The United States has a powerful stake in that very complex competition and in shaping a careful long-term strategy for enhancing the chances for a new moderate order which best protects our interests and reflects our values. What we need to convey is a clear sense of what we stand for, not just what we stand against. An agenda that offers a powerful antidote to extremists who are much better at tearing things down than building anything up. It seems to me that a workable long-term American strategy has three interconnected elements: support for pluralism and democratic change, economic opportunity, and regional peace and security. All three are crucial to our broader goal of enhancing the chances that moderates will shape the new regional order more than extremists. All three require us to look carefully at where the United States can uniquely make a difference, and at how best to mobilize other countries inside and outside the region in common cause. And all three require us to find a sensible course between self-defeating inaction and unsustainable unilateralism. We also have to be honest with ourselves. There will inevitably be some tough trade-offs among these priorities at different moments, and times when it will be hard to weigh the long-term benefits of pushing democratic reforms against short-term security demands. But all three elements have to frame our broader agenda. Let me touch quickly on each of them. Democratic reform can proceed in different ways and at different paces in different places in the region, but there won't be a moderate outcome to the second Arab awakening over the next generation without it. Whether in countries in post-revolutionary transition or countries trying to stay ahead of the wave of change through evolutionary reform, the United States consistently emphasizes a common set of principles: respect for the rule of law, peaceful and inclusive political processes, protecting the fundamental rights of all citizens, including women and minorities and people of all faiths, and steady focus on building strong democratic institutions, real checks and balances, and vibrant civil societies. We try to hold leaders and parties of every political shape to these standards. When it comes to building sustainable democracies, the most consequential distinction is not between Islamists and secularists, but between those who embrace pluralism based on rule of law and those who seek to impose their own vision on others. All parties need to engage in the political process and not sit on the sidelines. Those in power have a special responsibility to make clear that force is no substitute for politics and that a majority is no substitute for dialogue and consensus. And all must condemn and prevent violence, which truly poisons politics. Whether in fragile post-revolutionary states like Tunisia or Egypt, or in monarchies trying to keep pace with their people's expectations like Morocco or Jordan, sustainable democratic change depends upon the full participation of all citizens in political and economic life. The belief of all citizens that their peacefully expressed views are heard and respected, and the conviction of all citizens that they share a stake in their country's future. No democratic transition can succeed without a sense of confidence in a better and more inclusive economic future. Unless the second Arab awakening is accompanied by an economic awakening, it will collapse. The hard truth is that most Arab societies have ducked serious economic reform for far too long. Where economic liberalization has occurred, its benefits have often been limited to a privileged few. But serious reform cannot take place in a sustainable manner without basic political consensus on the rules of the game, lest it provoke chaos and instability. That's why inclusive politics and inclusive economic change have to go hand in hand, and why the long-term goal should be societies in which getting ahead depends less on who you know and more on what you know. There is much more that we and other outsiders can do to support long-term economic reform. Even more than conventional assistance, we can use the promise of market access and open trading arrangements to encourage reform. We can use initiatives like the New Enterprise Fund in Tunisia to support small and medium-sized enterprises. And we can invest even more actively in helping to renovate educational systems and promoting scholarships and exchanges so that the next generation is better equipped to compete and succeed. Those are some of the very best investments in a moderate future for the region that I can imagine. Finally, just as sustainable democratic reform and economic opportunity depend on one another, both depend on a more stable regional environment. I hardly need to tell any of you how hard it will be to make progress on the deepening crisis in Syria, or the Iranian nuclear issue, or the long-stalled Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But these are areas in which American diplomacy and influence can make a difference, and in which we have a profound stake. Our interests and credibility are at risk on each of them. While I realize that there are lots of other significant security priorities for American policy, from the continuing importance of working for stability in Iraq to getting ahead of terrorist threats in the Maghreb, let me just offer a few brief thoughts on Syria, Iran, and the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. The scale and scope of the human tragedy in Syria today is staggering, and it is inexorably becoming a regional tragedy. More than 140,000 Syrians have died, more than 6.5 million people have been internally displaced, and more than 2 million have fled to neighboring countries. In Jordan, 1 out of 10 people is a Syrian refugee. In Lebanon, it's 1 out of 4. The crisis in Syria has spilled over to seriously inflamed politics in Iraq and Lebanon. State structures in Syria are crumbling, extremists are expanding their influence among the opposition, and the dangers of long-term sectarian conflict and fragmentation are growing rapidly. I know that my friend and colleague Robert Ford, who is completing an extraordinary diplomatic career and remains one of the most decent and sensible American diplomats with whom I've ever worked, will address this very complicated issue in a panel later in your program. But the simple truth is that there can be no stability in Syria, no continuation of the speech.
We have to be empathic and find out.
We have no illusions about the challenges on the road to achieving that objective, or about the very difficult day after, or more likely the very difficult years after. And we have no illusions about the rising extremist threat in Syria and the risks it poses to the region, to neighbors who already have more than their share of challenges. We're working hard to support a capable, moderate opposition that can help build a new Syria and confront al-Qaeda. But while continued assistance to the opposition is essential, the only workable approach to end the suffering of the Syrian people is through a negotiated transition. On Iran, let me say simply that our concerns are profound and they extend beyond the nuclear issue across a range of dangerous Iranian behavior that threatens our interests and those of our friends in the Gulf and elsewhere in the region, and threatens the human rights of Iran's own citizens. While all of these concerns are important and serious, the nuclear issue remains the most urgent. Since his first days in office, President Obama has made very clear that he will do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. He's also emphasized his readiness and determination to seek a negotiated resolution. To get there, we worked with Congress and our international partners to put in place an unprecedented set of sanctions whose pressures have had a dramatic impact on Iran's economy. I can assure you that we've entered this diplomatic chapter with our eyes wide open. I led the American delegation in quiet bilateral talks last year, which helped produce a landmark first-step agreement between Iran and the P5+1. Together, we're now embarked on negotiations for a comprehensive solution. As the President himself has said, there's probably no better than a 50-50 chance that Iran will ultimately accept an agreement that can guarantee the peaceful nature of its program. But for the first time in many years, we now have a real opportunity to test Iran's intentions, and we and our partners will pursue it seriously. On the Palestinian issue, I'm convinced that the status quo between Palestinians and Israelis is as unsteady, unsustainable, and combustible as the sclerotic political systems that have crumbled elsewhere in the region over the past several years. I have never been a big believer in the notion that we have to let the conflict ripen to the point that resolution seems more likely. I'm afraid the more likely effect of that approach is to watch the prospects for a two-state solution, which is so deeply in the interests of Israel's long-term security, as well as the interests of Palestinians and the region, wither and die in the vine. President Obama underscored in Jerusalem last spring his belief that progress toward Middle East peace is necessary, just, and possible. And Secretary Kerry has worked tirelessly to push both sides to make the very difficult choices necessary to finally bring this conflict to an end. None of this will be easy. It never has been. Former Secretary of State Jim Baker, for whom I worked and have great admiration, keeps a whole wall of caustic newspaper cartoons outside his office in Houston, reminders of the skepticism surrounding his 9 trips to the Middle East before the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. But he proved his doubters wrong, and diplomacy worked. That's our challenge again today. And that's the challenge that Secretary Kerry has taken on to his great credit in the face of similar skepticism. I suspect that I'm now perilously close to George Bernard Shaw's 20-minute rule for brevity in public speaking, so I'll close with a very simple thought. I'm not naive about the Middle East, or how little we really know about where this period of profound change will take the region and its people. The story that is unfolding is also very much a story of Arab peoples taking their own destiny in their own hands, which should provide a cautionary note about the degree to which we can help shape their futures. The Middle East can be very unforgiving for American policymakers and diplomats, and it would be foolish to assume the best. But we can't afford to pull back from the region, whether because of security risks or rebalanced priorities or policy fatigue or domestic preoccupations. There's too much at issue right now, and we can increase the odds that moderates across the region can succeed over time if we continue to stay engaged actively and creatively on behalf of democratic change, economic opportunity, and regional peace and security. We will not get every judgment right or take every risk that we should, but we are far better off working persistently to help shape events rather than wait for them to be shaped for us. Thank you very much.
We have a distinctive honor the Institute has been enabled to give to the remarkable generosity of Ted Mayer and the Mayer family. This is the first in a series of awards for the distinguished people who are with us. The initial recipient was Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, and it is given in the name of Dr. Jean Mayer, our wonderful former president and chancellor, and I'd like to have Ma, one of our Colloquium members, please describe the gentleman and present the award to Ambassador Norris.
My name is Mahpari Sotoudeh, and I am a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium. The Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award is given to distinguished scholars and practitioners dedicated to solving the most pressing problems facing the world. Throughout his storied career at the Department of State, Ambassador Burns has been at the forefront of American diplomacy, from Amman to Moscow and beyond. As representative of this year's EPIIC Colloquium, I am honored to bestow this award upon Ambassador Burns for his public service and tireless efforts to promote global peace and security.
We're going to conduct a brief question and answer period. If there are people who wish to address the ambassador, could you please find the microphone and we'll recognize you. The question should be succinct, and obviously they can be directed at one person. It's not me. Sir.
Hello, my name is Nadav. I'm from the Israeli Defense Force delegation. Mr. Deputy Secretary, as you mentioned, the U.S. is leading today, together with 5 world powers, negotiations with Iran aimed at striking a comprehensive deal on the nuclear issue. I'd like to know, in your opinion, if such a deal is achieved, well, will the United States see it as a first step towards improving broader relations with Iran? And I dare ask, will the United States see Iran a stabilizing force in the region rather than a non-stabilizing one?
It's a very good question, thank you. I don't underestimate for a moment the range of differences, not just between the United States and Iran, but between Iran, Israel, and our friends in the Persian Gulf, and elsewhere in the region. There are huge challenges, I think, to be overcome, and a great deal of historical baggage in our relationship, which has led to enormous mistrust. We were able to overcome some of that mistrust in reaching this first step agreement, but there are huge challenges ahead of trying to reach a comprehensive solution on the nuclear issue. And I think it's going to take a great deal of time and effort to try to reduce the enormous mistrust which exists across a range of other issues too. So I don't underestimate the amount of time and effort it's going to take. But as I said in my remarks, I think the nuclear issue remains the most immediate of the challenges before us, and it's important for us to try to focus on that as best we can. Sure. This will go back.
Yes, right.
Mr. Burns, my name is Vladimir Plotov. I'm from the Russian delegation here. First and foremost, thanks for your rousing speech. And I have a question regarding the current America-Russia relationship. do you believe that in the future this cooperation can bring very successful results, and this cooperation can just help our world to be safe and secure?
I'd certainly like to think that that's possible. We've made some progress in recent years on the START agreement to reduce nuclear weapons, which is an important contribution to the rest of the world's security, as well as our own progress in working together in Afghanistan on the Iranian nuclear issue. But we also have to be honest with ourselves. We've had some pretty severe differences as well over Ukraine today, and over Syria as well. So to answer your question, sure. I think it makes enormous sense in the interests of not only the United States and Russia, but the rest of the world to try to work together. The reality is that Russia and the United States are both permanent members of the UN Security Council. Together, we control something like 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Russia and the United States today are two of the biggest players in hydrocarbons in the world. So objectively, it makes a lot of sense to work together. But we have some significant differences to be overcome, and I hope that we can find ways to overcome them and work together seriously on the range of issues that you mentioned. Thanks.
Ewald from U.S. Army War College. There are some doubts in the Gulf region about the dialogue now between the United States and Iran.
I've noticed that.
Yeah, concerning the nuclear, issue. So my question, from your perspective, what is the best option for Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states if Iran acquires the nuclear weapon?
Well, I think it's a lousy option for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and I think President Obama has been quite clear in his determination to ensure that that doesn't happen. As I said before, we're very mindful of the concerns that our friends and partners in the Gulf have about a range of other behavior on the part of this Iranian government, extending well beyond the nuclear issue. Efforts to destabilize some of our friends, whether it's in the Gulf, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, and other parts of the world. The efforts that Iran is supporting in Syria, in support of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and in support of the bloody chaos we see there today, and the enormous consequence in terms of loss of life and displacement of people. So it seems to me that there's a great deal that remains common to the interests of Saudi Arabia and the United States. It's one of the reasons that President Obama is going to travel to Saudi Arabia at the end of March, is to try to reinforce a sense of common purpose in dealing not only with the challenges posed by Iran's behavior, go beyond the nuclear issue, but also in terms of other issues in the region where I think we have a common interest in trying to promote stability and trying to push back against extremism. Sorry. Hi.
Hi, sir. My name is Gabriella from the United States Military Academy of West Point. Thank you for speaking with us. Since 9/11, we've seen a growth in the way that state and DoD interact at the operational level. We've seen the growth of programs like the BOI program and the leverage of provincial reconstruction teams. How do you see the last decade plus of conflict interacting or impacting future DoD and state interaction?
No, I think the experience, especially of the last decade, while we've had huge challenges, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or other parts of the world, has taught all of us, I think, the importance of deepening relationships between state and the Pentagon, both uniformed military and civilians. There's a whole generation of American diplomats now that have learned an even deeper respect for what the U.S. military does for our country and have learned the importance of working together. So I'm not trying to suggest that the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan are going to be repeated in the decades ahead. I sincerely hope we don't have to repeat that. But I do think the lessons that we've learned about working together on issues like that, and the importance of diplomats trying to avoid the conflicts into which the U.S. military can be drawn, it is something that's become clearer and clearer to all of us. Hi.
My name is Mahpari, former MP from Bahrain. We hear a lot here about U.S. exceptionalism for the commitment for human rights and democracy. Does Bahrain fit under U.S. exceptionalism? The second question is about U.S. engagement with the Bahraini regime, the military engagement. How do you see the impact of this engagement from Bahrainis?
Well, the first part of your question, I think the question of human rights in Bahrain, the question of an evolution in the direction of pluralism and respecting the rights of all Bahraini citizens is extremely important. It's not a favor to the United States. It's deeply in the self-interest of Bahrain and its future stability and security. And so it's important for the United States to be plain spoken about our concerns on some of those issues. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons, to get to your second question, that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've restrained the provision of certain kinds of security equipment to the Bahraini government because we were concerned about its use against protesters and opposition political figures. We recognize the importance of continuing to try to deepen the relationship with the Bahraini military, dealing with external threats, and working together in the Gulf. But we tried to make clear our concern about the importance of focusing on taking into account the demands of peaceful political opposition in Bahrain. Hi.
Welcome to the Norris Symposium, Mr. Burns.
Thanks.
I'm Stavridis, and I'm from Network in 2014 from Afghanistan. So President Obama announced that they're contemplating the zero option for Afghanistan. What do you think would be the repercussions of this decision for the country and for the region?
Well, it's not a decision. I mean, what President Obama has done, along with NATO partners, and made this clear to President Karzai when they spoke on the phone a few days ago, is that because we haven't yet signed a bilateral security agreement, as a matter of prudent planning, we have to consider a range of options. Our hope still is that that bilateral security agreement can be signed, whether it's by President Karzai or whoever's elected president in the elections, which are going to be a very important moment for Afghanistan, because that opens up the possibility, at least, that we and our coalition partners can continue to contribute to security and stability in Afghanistan. After all that we and Afghans have invested in the last dozen years, I think it's very important for us to continue to do everything we can to help ensure a more stable future for Afghanistan. Yeah. Mess up your whole program.
There will just be 2 more questions. I'm wondering, Patrick, if you'll see and have a possibility of our international guests take the microphone for a bit.
Absolutely, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have 2 questions.
It must be one. Nothing.
All right, good.
Choose.
Okay, I'm Los Angeles Times covering Syria, and I'm planning tomorrow about Syria. We saw a pivoting away, to use your words, with the engagement in Syria, I guess last August. And now we're hearing again sort of a ramping up rhetoric with regards to actually engaging with some kind of military intervention in Syria. My question for you is, well, most of those efforts have focused on the southern front of Syria, basically through Jordan. So my question is, has there actually been any kind of change in the Israeli government's position with regards to training rebels on its own grounds? And have you actually seen, well, I mean, has the U.S. spearheaded that effort? Because it hasn't been passed. And one little thing, did you actually write that Dagestani wedding cable?
It was a good cable, but there was a wonderful political officer who was working with me who deserves most of the credit for it too. So, but it's fun. Foreign service reporting is still, one of the things that I value most in our profession. On your question about Syria, I was in Jordan a couple of weeks ago, and I spent off and on a good bit of my professional career there. And so I understand the burdens that Jordan is operating under right now, not just in terms of refugees, but economic pressures and everything else. And I think there's a clear recognition that the longer the civil war in Syria continues, the greater the danger, not just to Jordan, but Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey as well in a different respect. And so it's been very important for us to do everything we can, not just to deal with the humanitarian pressure that's created by refugee outflow, but also to try to find ways in which we can strengthen the moderate opposition. And I can't, for obvious reasons, go into a lot of detail about how we're trying to do that. But I think it's very important in the South, as well as in the North, which is in some ways more complicated, to work as actively as we can to strengthen that support right now. Because otherwise, I think the drift and continuation of the Civil War is going to create huge problems, not just for individual Syrians, which are horrific enough, but also for the region. Because, as I said in my remarks, Syria is increasingly becoming an enormous regional challenge as well. So we're very mindful of the pressures on Turkey.
Your last question?
Sorry, my long answer to the problem. So let's see.
My name is Suzanne Blay, and I'm an international relations and diplomacy student at the Anglo-American University of Prague, and I'm part of the Kurdistan delegation. My question is in regards to U.S.-Kurdish relations. The Kurds have been loyal to the United States forever. We owe our success to the United States. We were one of the only people in Iraq who were actually thankful for the invasion in 2003. Also, in 1991, the establishment of the no-fly zone and the safe haven saved our life. We are becoming a major player in the Middle East, and we would like to see our relationship or bilateral relations with the United States strengthened, further consolidated, and then hopefully we're able to create a long-term, sincere, and strong relationship with the United States. Is that something that is possible for us to create in the future?
Sure. Well, we're very proud of first of what Kurds in the KRG have accomplished for themselves against considerable odds over much of the last 20 years. We've certainly done a lot to try to contribute to that. We continue to believe, as I think the leadership of the KRG does, that the interests of Kurds in the North are best served in a stable, healthy Iraq. And certainly in energy terms, I think that's the case, where everybody in Iraq benefits by completing the strategic pipeline that runs from south through Anbar and the Sunni Arab areas, through the north into Turkey. I think that's a way of binding people throughout the country together politically, and it also offers enormous economic benefits. So I think Kurds in Iraq and the KRG, as you know better than I do, are an enormously important part of Iraq's future, and we'll continue to work on it. But thank you all very much for the chance.